Up next, we have Robin Washington, who is the editor of the Duluth News Tribune, one of the first journalists to interview Barack Obama 20 years ago in Boston. He's a contributor to the National Public Radio and has made numerous appearances on MSNBC, BET News, Fox News, ABC News, CNN, and the BBC. Before joining the Duluth News Tribune in 2004, Washington was a reporter and columnist for the Boston Herald. He was also executive producer of the landmark PBS documentary about the first freedom ride and the origins of the civil rights movement entitled "You Don't Have a Ride, Jim Crow." Washington himself was part of the movement as a child of Black and Jewish activists in Chicago, participating in sit-ins and protests when he was 3 years old. Today, he recalls these actions fondly as family outings, recognizing also that they were significant events that moved our country forward. His topic today is From Promissory Note to the Promised Land.
Thank you, Danica. And thank you, Keon, Grace. That was a wonderful rendition of a wonderful speech, wasn't it? It's another hand of applause. Keon and Grace are on a beautiful journey, and they chose a powerful place to start. I have a dream as part of the fabric of our nation. It's every bit as much so as the Gettysburg Address, and every bit as much as the truths that we hold to be self-evident in what made us a nation. It's equal to the reassurance that we have only fear itself to fear during the worst economic disaster of our time, and in the second worst today. But the dream Dr. King described on August 28, 1963, remained a dream on August 29, 1963. And the promissory note that he and 250,000 others came to redeem that day remain uncashed. President Kennedy didn't come out to shake his hand at the podium. Congress did not draft and pass a civil rights bill that day or anytime soon. In fact, what did happen 2 weeks later was something that turned the dream into a nightmare. In Birmingham, Alabama, it was a scene that we can all imagine very much so today. On September 15th, somebody crazy with hate, if you want to qualify it, interrupted a peaceful Sunday morning church service with a bomb. It took the lives of 4 African American girls. 3 of them were 14. 1 was 11. 23 others were injured. You can imagine that today. And in the aftermath, like today, people called for justice, some reminding the world that only a week before, Governor George Wallace said that all that was needed to stop integration in Alabama was a few first-class funerals. Does that sound familiar today? I want to make an aside to say that people love to put words into Dr. King's mouth. You've all heard it. They love to say that if Dr. King were alive today, he'd be for so-and-so, and he'd be against such and such, right? You've heard it. How about this one? If Dr. King were alive today, he'd be against affirmative action, right? You've heard that. How about, I haven't heard this yet, but I'm sure we will. If Dr. King were alive today, he'd be against Obamacare. And I know you heard this one, and this might divide people, but if Dr. King were alive today, he'd definitely be against gay marriage. Well, how does anybody know that? What I do know is what Martin Luther King would say to the tragedy of Tucson last week, because he said it in his eulogy for the 4 little girls in Birmingham. These children, unoffending, innocent, and beautiful, were the victims of one of the most vicious and tragic crimes ever perpetrated against humanity. Yet they died nobly. They are the martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity. Yes, the motivation then may have been different if we ever do find out the motivation of last week's rampage, but the hate and the result are the same. The result is the same. Even after that horror, Martin's dream still didn't become a reality. And a promissory note, meaning the Civil Rights Bill, was still uncashed. It would take another horror, another national tragedy, on November 22nd of that year, this time taking the life of the President of the United States. It was then, in his memory, that Congress began to act on the Civil Rights Bill. A year later came the Voting Rights Act, and a promissory note was finally cashed. The check even cleared. No longer could blacks be, or anyone, be legally denied accommodations or the right to vote or to suffer indignities of any sort. If you're having trouble understanding just what those laws meant, I want to give you an example right here in this facility, the new one just put up. If there were no Civil Rights Act, I'll back up. You may have heard this, you may not have. Civil Rights Act, of course, as I just said, opened up public accommodation to African Americans, really made the 14th Amendment of equal protection a reality that had been ignored. The Voting Rights Act was exactly that. It made denials of voting illegal. But the biggest beneficiaries of the Civil Rights Act were actually women, and in particular white women. So I wanted to point out here that if there had been no Civil Rights Act, there had been no Title IX. And if there were no Title IX, then one of the most successful teams in the history of college sports that plays right here wouldn't exist. It's something we can think about here. And by the way, if it improved the lives of white women, all of us know and have been touched by a white woman at some point, it improved all of our lives. So if the promissory note was redeemed, Martin Luther King's dream still wasn't done. Early in his career, during the bus boycott in Montgomery, King began to see the difference between nonviolence as a tactic and as a way of life. He said to the Reverend Glenn Smiley, a man I got to know later in life, who was a mentor to King, "Glenn, I want to know how to adopt nonviolence in my heart." The aftermath of nonviolence, King later wrote, is the creation of the beloved community, so that when the battle is over, a new relationship comes into being between the oppressed and the oppressor. So when Congress did its job, King's heart was still unsatisfied. He knew the root of human suffering was more than laws that separated people by color, and that the sufferers were more than just black people. He knew that they were children in Vietnam and every other war zone. He knew the pain of hunger in poor people in Appalachia and on reservations in every corner of America. And when King spoke out against these evils, not a lot of people came to shake his hand that time either. America wanted to hear the dream. It didn't want to see the reality. That reality led him to shift gears and to concentrate on social injustices of the North as well as the South. He brought his movement to Chicago, where my family and many others have been fighting against de facto segregation. In the South, segregation had been de jure, or by law. In the North, de facto segregation means by fact, or just the way it is. Because white people live on one side of town, or people of color on another, and the same with rich and poor people. You know it. Look at Duluth. I want to make it clear that on the marches I went to in Chicago as a small child, we chanted 2, 4, 6, 8. We want to integrate. We didn't say desegregate. That's important because we were standing for something, not against something. I'm going to depart from my script a little bit here because I thought I was going to take ISD 709 to task for my friends like Allegra, who I thought the title was Desegregation Specialist, but I just heard her say, and I'm corrected, Diversity Integration Specialist. That's progress. So what we fought for in Chicago was the same vision that Dr. King had in his vision of a beloved community, of being for something. Don't think that that was popular with black people then or today. How many times have those of us in black circles heard, we were better off under segregation? That's true for some people. Maybe we did have some money in our pockets, but the cost was the dignity of the rest of us. Chicago was not a victory for Martin Luther King. He spent 2 years in the city, and if any of you have been there recently, you know that de facto segregation is alive and well, economically as well as socially. And again, take a look at our own city. By the time he got to Memphis in the spring of 1968 for the sanitation workers' strike, Martin Luther King wasn't the popular preacher he had been. His talk about nonviolence and integration was laughed at by black militant groups, and his pacifism against the Vietnam War and every other war was an irritant to President Johnson. The first march he led in Memphis for the sanitation workers was a disaster. It was not nonviolent, and he got the blame. But if he should have been in the depths of despair, he didn't show that either. Something had happened to Martin. In his speech late on the night of April 3rd, he recounted the triumphs of human history and also told of his own brushes with death. He told of an attack 10 years earlier by a demented black woman who had stabbed him and how the blade almost punctured his aorta. He said if he had sneezed, he would have died. He told how a young white girl from suburban New York wrote to him saying she was glad he didn't sneeze, and he was glad too. And he told of bomb threats that very day when he boarded the plane to Memphis. Like anyone, he said, I would like to live. And he paused. A long life. Longevity has its place. I can see his voice cracking when I look at the film, and I swear I see tears in his eyes when he says that. But I'm not worried about that now, he adds, because I have seen the Promised Land. I may not get there with you, but we as a people will get to the Promised Land. The next day we learn he wouldn't get there with us, and the words have become immortal and hauntingly prophetic. It chills us to hear them. But if we listen, we hear more than a foretelling of tragedy. We hear this time of a promised land, of a beloved community of all people, free of war and pestilence and assaults on dignity, not of a promissory note to right past wrongs. And I think he really did see that promised land, even in the depths of his despair and the crushes of his defeats, by maintaining a belief in the inherent ability of human beings to love. He often said, and he said that night of his final speech, that ours is no longer a choice between nonviolence and violence. It's a choice between nonviolence and non-existence. And if we somehow made it through the terrors of those times, then maybe it was because of our love. What else could allow us to persevere? I think that might be Pollyannish. I'm fooling myself. Maybe he truly was prophetic. Maybe he did see his death the next day and was speaking literally. Or maybe he was simply in touch with the obvious signals that come when you board a plane and they say there's a bomb threat. Possibly he thought, like with the Kennedy assassination, his own death would bring a passage of another human act, not a congressional act, but acts of kindness. It didn't. History has since served us no end of inhumanity to one another, from the riots following his death to the Holocaust, I said plural, and ethnic cleansing in Cambodia, Rwanda, and former Yugoslavia. Even after the lesson of Vietnam, the deaths of 58,000 Americans, the United States has used war as an early option, not a final one, in diplomacy. And our de facto social inequities continue today. I shouldn't say it again, but yes, in Duluth. But if Martin Luther King saw anything from his turbulent times, he saw their ebb and flow. That following the height of inspiration at the March of Washington can come unspeakable horror in the Birmingham church bombings. And following the horror of the Kennedy assassination can come some change, meaningful change, in the Civil Rights Act. Today, we are a little more than a week away from another horror, Our president, a direct inheritor of King's sacrifice and so many others, spoke to it in the loss of a 9-year-old girl and 19 others caught in the gunfire. If this tragedy prompts reflection and debate, Barack Obama said, let's make sure it's worthy of those we have lost. The loss of these wonderful people should make every one of us strive to be better. Obama followed King by choosing not to rub salt into the wounds of his adversaries, but instead to ask his nation to move beyond blame. It was not, quote, a simple lack of civility that caused this tragedy, he said, but only a more civil and honest public discourse, he said, could end it. I think he took a page from King, who wrote, "The end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of the beloved community. It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform oppressors into friends." Like the 60s, these are troubled times. All times are. There really are no good old days. Can you think of any, really? But when the worst happens, we can, and we often, become our best. That's what I think the promised land King saw was. And if so, I know why he said we'd get there, because it's here, today, in every one of you. Thank you.